Children, we have a surprise this evening. Dr. James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman are going to read us a fairy tale this evening.
Hello, kids. I'm Dr. James White. What fairy tale would you like us to read?
Ooh, I have one. Can we read about the magical scribe who flew on his magic carpet all over the ancient world, sneaking into all the churches to add 12 verses to the end of St. Mark's Gospel?
Excellent choice. Let's begin.
Once upon a time, in a church far, far away, there lived unknown scribes who had no names and no actual existence to corroborate. Legend tells us these unknown scribes took it upon themselves to compose a proper ending to St. Mark's Gospel, which the apostle had apparently left unfinished. Due to the arduous task of translating a new ending into all the known languages of the ancient world, the scribes set out to go back to the future to pick out the latest in technological advancements. With the scribes' investment in top-of-the-line hardware and software components, they were successfully able to translate a new ending into the languages of Aramaic, Vetus Latin, Upper and Lower Egyptian, Ethiopian, Greek, Gothic, and other ancient dialects. Now came the hard part. These unknown scribes were tasked with travelling throughout the ancient world to sneak 12 verses into the Apostolic Churches' New Testament texts, without anyone ever noticing. Clandestine operations of this kind required the assistance of the US Special Forces divisions to train the scribes in covert tactics to avoid detection during their mission. Once training was complete, the scribes set off to the Church of Rome, where Eusebius writes that Mark first published his Gospel. Here, the scribes ran into some resistance, unaware Christians were being persecuted by the Roman Empire. The scribes then travelled east to Alexandria via a magic carpet ride, where Eusebius records in his histories that Mark preached the Gospel that he had written, ensuring the Apostolic Churches of the region would not be deprived a fitting ending to St. Mark's Gospel. Next stop was uptown, to the offices of the Greek Orthodox churches located at Antioch, so they can upload these 12 verses onto their database servers for dissemination to the major dioceses. The scribes continued in their travels, visiting the foster churches of St. John in Asia Minor, donning their ninja gear as they attempted to exchange out the texts in these prominent apostolic sees, under the cover of darkness. Next, these unknown scribes hitched a ride on a C-130 with the US Army's 82nd Airborne Division to parachute onto the churches of Ethiopia. From here, the scribes thought it would be fun to tour the local safaris on their way up to Carthage and Hippo in North Africa. After hearing about Jerome's revision in Bethlehem, the scribes thought they would assist Jerome by providing him the updated copies of the ending of St. Mark in Greek and Latin for the production of his Vulgate. Last but not least, after the scribes dropped off copies to the Aramaic churches in Edessa, they hopped off on an elephant and made their way to their final destination, arriving at the churches of India. Thanks to the efforts of these unknown scribes, which history seems to have forgotten to document, the Gospel of St. Mark was updated with 12 new verses, which seems to have escaped the attention of the fathers in the 2nd and 3rd century that were quoting from this section of St. Mark's Gospel. Sorry, James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman. We don't believe in fairy tales. If you're going to continue to assert that these verses were magically added by some unknown scribes to account for it being found in almost all the versions preserved by the Apostolic Churches, please provide empirical documentation as to how these unknown scribes were able to carry out such an impossible task. And can you please provide us with names, dates and locations for such a historical event of 12 verses being added to all the publications of St. Mark's Gospel, instead of just asserting that some scribe added it. Otherwise, it just sounds like make-believe. The end. Defense of the last 12 verses of St. Mark's Gospel. The words of Irenaeus. Also, towards the conclusion of his Gospel, Mark says, "So then, after the Lord Jesus has spoken to them, he was received up unto heaven, and sitteth on the right hand of God, confirming what had been spoken by the prophet. The Lord said to my Lord, Sit down on my right hand, until I make thy foes thy footstool." When Irenaeus, in his third book against the heresies, deliberately quotes some remarks upon the 19th verse of the last chapter of St. Mark's Gospel, we are put in possession of the certain fact that the entire passage now under examination was extant in copies of the Gospel that were used by the bishop of the Apostolic Church of Lyons around 180 AD. Who sees not that this single piece of evidence is in itself sufficient to outweigh the testimony of James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman's apocryphal texts? For the primary evidence James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman cite against the genuineness of these verses are two so-called 4th century Greek texts, whose history, origins, and authorship are unknown. These texts cannot establish a legal chain of custody to any apostolic church. Therefore, its content cannot be relied upon to witness to the original writings of the apostles that were read in the apostolic churches. And since the texts of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus cannot verify its reliability, the contents within its pages are only hearsay, and wouldn't be considered admissible evidence in any court of law. How soon do these scholars forget that the Venerable Erasmus of Rotterdam had already examined the text of Vaticanus and rejected its readings? For Erasmus even took the additional steps to specifically condemn the text of Vaticanus in his own 1535 preface of his Greek text. As we have already documented in our previous segment, Daniel Wallace also rejects the text of Vaticanus when he departs from its reading on John 7:8 for an alternative text. Nevertheless, the text of Sinaiticus was found collecting dust and neglected in the monastery of St. Catherine's until its discovery in 1845, where it wasn't even being used for its daily divine liturgy. Are these really the type of witnesses that James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman are basing the entirety of their arguments on? These texts do not represent the texts used in the official Greek Orthodox churches, for the evidence before us pales in comparison to the overwhelming Greek manuscript testimony that supports these 12 verses. We have called upon the testimony of Dr. Wilbur N. Pickering, who has graciously accepted our invitation to speak on matters relating to the textual evidence in this case. He is more than qualified to speak on the subject, as he has earned a THM and PhD in linguistics, and is a published author in the field of textual criticism. His works include The Identity of the New Testament Text and the Greek New Testament Collection. Dr. Pickering notes that the passage in question is contained in every extant Greek manuscript, about 1800, except 3 codices, 2 of which were named above and a 12th century minuscule, identified as 304. In addition, Dr. Pickering documents that the Syriac, Latin, Coptic, and Gothic versions all massively support the passage. Only the Armenian and Georgian versions, both 5th century, omit it. Dr. Pickering also records that these verses are also contained in all extant lectionaries, and claimed for 2 of the Church's greatest festivals, Easter and Ascension. But when we appeal to the overwhelming witness testimony that supports this section of St. Mark's Gospel, we are met with fairy tales of unknown scribes adding these verses to all the texts, which history has neglected to report. For James White, Daniel Wallace, and Bart Erhman would have us believe that the Apostolic Churches were oblivious to such an update in its sacred scriptures, yet the historical records don't support their assertions. For the change of one word from gourd to ivy in Jerome's Vulgate caused the congregations of North Africa to riot, as reported by Augustine of Hippo in his letters to Jerome, and Dr. Pickering correctly identifies the testimony of Gaius, an Orthodox father who wrote near the end of the 2nd century, who named 4 heretics, who not only altered the text, but had disciples who mutilated copies of their efforts. Yet the additions of 12 verses to the ending of St. Mark's Gospel by their unnamed scribes have not been recorded by any ancient witness. Now, if Bart, James, and Daniel are truly seeking St. Mark's original text, then why don't they begin their investigation by first visiting the official Greek and Coptic Apostolic Churches of Alexandria, which still exists to this day? Eusebius recorded in his histories that St. Mark was the first to set out for Egypt and preached there the gospel that he himself had written down, establishing the first Apostolic Churches in Alexandria that he presided over as its first bishop. Should we not equally call upon the voice of Irenaeus, this esteemed father of the Apostolic Church of Lyons, to weigh in on this section of St. Mark's Gospel that he definitely quotes as the conclusion? Surely Irenaeus is in a better position to testify to the authenticity of these verses than Bart Erhman, James White and Daniel Wallace. Does not Irenaeus' early origin and locality, having been born in Smyrna around 120 AD, put him over 200 years ahead of Bart, James and Daniel's apocryphal texts? For Irenaeus was an eyewitness to the Apostolic Churches of Gaul and Asia Minor, having been appointed to the Episcopate of Lyons, and learned at the feet of Polycarp, Bishop of the Apostolic Church of Smyrna, who according to Tertullian was appointed by the Apostle John himself. Yet, it's not this father's standing in the 2nd century that we appeal to, but his testimony, which successfully demonstrated that the independent apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean world basically witnessed to the same New Testament text, naming the same authors, while the Gnostic texts fundamentally disagreed with each other. In doing so, Irenaeus and Tertullian witnessed to the historical criterion for identifying the original writings of the apostles, while explaining the system used to establish the custody, control, and transmission of the scriptures that guarded against corruption, and providing an objective standard to verify what writings were received for future textual examination. For this was the method of textual criticism that ruled out the Gnostic texts, and it's the same method of textual criticism used by the fathers of the church to verify those last 12 verses as the original writings of St. Mark. Since James White, Daniel Wallace and Bart Erhman continue to ignore Irenaeus' and Tertullian's testimony on the method of textual criticism used by the Apostolic Churches that basically served as the historical objective standard for over 1800 years, until reasoned eclecticism made its debut in the late 1900s. We have decided to send these scholars back to school for a much-needed history lesson in Textual Criticism 101. After all, these scholars' approach to textual criticism first rejects the commonly received texts that have been preserved in the Apostolic Churches. Neither White, Wallace nor Erhman supports the textual traditions of the Greek, Aramaic, Coptic or Latin Apostolic Churches, which constitute the ecclesiastical text. Instead, they continue to rely on apocryphal texts that cannot establish a legal chain of custody to any apostolic church in which these texts were read. And as we have already established in our previous segment, White, Wallace and Erhman reject these same apocryphal texts when they don't support their individual convictions. Their reasoned eclecticism approach to textual criticism leaves us devoid of any real objective standards, as Dr. Pickering identifies when he states, "Today's textual criticism turns for its final validation to the appraisal of individual readings that involves subjective judgment." In doing so, Dr. Pickering specifies two primary canons of criticism as the basis of their textual examination. First, that reading is to be preferred which best suits the context, and second, that reading is to be preferred which best explains the origin of all others. With evaluation criteria such as this, it's no surprise the reading in John 7:8 is rejected in some circles, whilst others include it. After 28 editions of its Nestle-Aland text, one would think that we would have found the original writings of the apostles, but since we must preserve the copyright, new editions are surely on the horizon. Yet, the historical method of textual criticism, as witnessed by Irenaeus and Tertullian, provides a truly scientific framework in which objective standards and criteria are applied in textual examination. Now, leading today's lesson plan, which should come as no surprise to White, Wallace and Erhman, is Irenaeus of Lyons, who was no stranger to variant readings. To illustrate our point, Irenaeus calls to our attention the several copies of St. John's Apocalypse, found in his day rendered the reading of 616 as the mark of the beast instead of 666. What was the measure of Irenaeus evaluated each reading against to determine the original text of the apostle? Hear the words of Irenaeus, in which he renders his final conclusion on this matter. Such then being the state of the case, and this number, 666, being found in all the most approved and ancient copies of the Apocalypse, and those men who saw John face to face bearing their testimony to it. Does not Irenaeus clearly demonstrate his command of textual criticism and documents the objective criteria these readings were evaluated against in drawing his conclusions prior to considering any internal evidence? For Irenaeus' method is clear. He first examined the most approved and ancient copies of St. John's Apocalypse, sourced from the Apostolic Churches known to the Apostles, which only found 666 in the text. Secondly, he appealed to witnesses who could independently confirm that this was the text that the Apostle John himself read before the congregation. Though this was a simple illustration, Irenaeus and Tertullian were dealing with a much larger textual issue than minor variations. For the 2nd century debate with the Gnostics was not just a theological feud, but primarily a textual issue over the original writings of the Apostles. This point is perfectly exemplified in the case of Marcion's text. Irenaeus' and Tertullian's own published writings attest to the fact that Marcion introduced a redacted text of Luke and 10 letters of Paul that were shorter, yet not better, which Marcion claimed were the official writings of Paul. Irenaeus substantiates this very statement in his first book against the heresies. Now hear his testimony. Marcion mutilated the Gospel according to Luke, removing everything about the birth of the Lord and much of the teaching of the words of the Lord, in which the Lord is recorded as clearly confessing the creator of this universe as his Father. He persuaded his disciples that he was more veracious than the apostles who handed down the Gospel, giving them not a Gospel but a mere fragment of a Gospel. He also similarly cut up the epistles of Paul, removing whatever the apostle said clearly about the God who made the world, and whatever the apostle teaches by referring to the prophetic writings that predict the coming of the Lord. Tertullian elucidated the primary reasons behind Marcion's removal of scriptures, specifically from the Gospel of Luke, in his own published works against Marcion, declaring Marcion is arguing from his antithesis that the text of Luke was interpolated by the defenders of Judaism, for the purpose of such a conglomeration with it of the law and the prophets as should enable them out of the fashion of their Christ. This accusation that Marcion levied against the Apostolic Churches in the 2nd century is the same charge brought by White, Wallace and Erhman against the Orthodox Churches, in that the ecclesiastical text has succumbed to interpolations, including such passages as the last 12 verses of St. Mark's Gospel and the woman in adultery in John's Gospel. Just as Marcion's aim was to restore the text of Luke and the letters of Paul to their original form, White, Wallace and Erhman are utilizing their own subjective methods for the same end. We now charge ahead to the center of the battlefield to meet our opponents head-on in order to demonstrate the historical objective method of textual criticism, witnessed by Irenaeus and Tertullian, that ruled out Marcion's and other Gnostic texts, while using this same historical method to substantiate these last 12 verses as the original writings of St. Mark's Gospel. Since James White was confounded by Irenaeus' and Tertullian's textual arguments in his review of our first 2 video segments, which aired on his Dividing Line series during the November 2016 broadcast, we are going to explain things at a slower pace, specifically for him, because we feel he has the most to gain from this argument. As proud members of the Anglican Communion and ardent defenders of Calvinistic theology, we feel that White falls prey to the very system he defends, which is then used against him in his debates, leading to his demise. For when James White and Daniel Wallace drop the fairy tale narrative and turn to the historical arguments used by the Apostolic Churches, they will quickly dispose of the likes of Bart Erhman and the Jesus Seminar. It is on that note that we proceed with our oral arguments. In order for a text to be considered an official writing of the Apostles, historically it had to be evaluated against the following objective criteria. First, the writing had to be apostolic, meaning the origins of the text had to physically trace back to an apostle or their scribes. Secondly, the writing had to demonstrate its accord with other copies that were universally received. This was the historical textual standard that Tertullian required the Gnostics to meet. When Tertullian declared, "Let all the heresies, when challenged to these 2 tests by our Apostolic Church, offer their proof how they deem themselves to be apostolic," he first sets before them the manner in which they can meet these legal requirements. He said, "Let them produce the original records of their churches. Let them unfold the roll of their bishops, running down in due succession from the beginning in such a manner that the first bishop of theirs shall be able to show for his ordainer and predecessor some of the apostles or of apostolic men. for this is the manner in which the Apostolic Churches transmit their registers, as the Church of Smyrna, which records that Polycarp was placed therein by John, as also the Church of Rome, which makes Clement to have been ordained in like manner by Peter. In exactly the same way the other churches likewise exhibit their several worthies, whom, as having been appointed to their episcopal places by apostles, they regard as transmitters of the apostolic seed. Secondly, Tertullian challenges the Gnostics to examine their textual claims against the writings read in the official churches established by the apostles, when he calls upon them to run over the Apostolic Churches, in which the very thrones of the apostles are still preeminent in their places, in which their own authentic writings are read, uttering the voice and representing the face of each of them severally. Here, Tertullian directs the Gnostics to the apostolic sees of Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Ephesus and Rome, all churches founded by the Apostle Paul, with the clear purpose of demonstrating to Marcion where Paul's official writings can be found. It is upon these same historical textual standards that Irenaeus and Tertullian set out to demonstrate, against Marcion's claims, that the texts that have come down through the Apostolic Churches represent the original writings of the Apostles. For Irenaeus opens his third book against the heresies by first identifying the canonical texts of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John as the official gospel publications of the Apostles. When Irenaeus proclaims that the tradition of the Apostles, made clear in all the world, can be clearly seen in every church by those who wish to behold the truth, he clearly demonstrates that the independent apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean world were basically witnessing to the same text, naming the same authors. On his very next point, Irenaeus outlines the system used which establishes the transfer, control and custody of the scriptures that have been guarded by the successions of bishops in the apostolic churches. For he proclaims, we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in the churches, and their successors down to our time. It is this system that establishes the legal chain of custody for the texts of the New Testament back to the apostles. When it comes to the Gospel of Luke, Tertullian uses the same textual criteria to demonstrate that the version of Luke that is current among the apostolic churches has stood its ground from the very first publication. Rejecting Marcion's claim, Luke's text has succumbed to interpolations by the defenders of Judaism. For when Tertullian states something along the line of, on the whole then, if that which is evidently more true, which is earlier, if that which is earlier, which is from the very beginning, if that which is from the beginning, which has the apostles for its authors, then it will certainly be quite evident that that which comes from the apostles has been kept as a sacred deposit in the churches of the apostles. He first sets up the evaluation criteria that will determine St. Luke's original text, testing for antiquity and apostolic authorship, eventually drawing the conclusion that the version that originated with the apostles would have been preserved in the churches founded by the apostles. He begins St. Luke's textual examination by first identifying the churches founded by the apostles, starting with the churches of Paul, naming the apostolic sees of Corinth, Galatia, Philippians, Thessalonians, and Ephesus. Tertullian next identifies the foster churches of St. John. Since Marcion rejected John's Apocalypse, Tertullian uses this opportunity to establish the apostolic origins of the text by demonstrating that the order of the bishops, therefore, when traced up to their origin, will yet rest on John as their author. Validating the text of the Apocalypse found in St. John's foster churches can establish a legal chain of custody back to the apostle himself. He then proceeds with his arguments, and demonstrates, in the same manner is recognized the excellent source of the other churches, that the Gospel of Luke, which we are defending with all our might, has stood its ground from its very first publication. Do not White, Wallace, and Erhman hear Tertullian identify that the most credible texts are found in the apostolic sees established by the apostles. By way of comparison, Tertullian demonstrates that Marcion's text is unknown and has not been received by any apostolic institution, whereas Marcion's gospel is not known to most people, and to none whatever is it known. It isn't known without being at the same time condemned. Tertullian then applies the same textual criteria to bear witness to the other gospel publications that Marcion also rejected. The same authority of the apostolic churches will afford evidence to the other gospels also, which we possess equally through their means, and according to their usage, I mean the Gospels of John and Matthew, while that which Mark published may be affirmed to be Peter's, whose interpreter Mark was. For even Luke's form of the gospel men usually ascribed to Paul. Not only does Tertullian establish the apostolic origins for these texts, but he also demonstrates that the independent apostolic churches throughout the Mediterranean world were basically witness to the same texts, naming the same authors. This testimony would be conclusive in any normal court of law. Under this same method of textual examination, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocalypse of Peter are all ruled out. These texts cannot establish a legal chain of custody to the apostles, and when we investigate the apostolic sees known to the apostles, those texts have not been received. Similarly, the text of the Maccabees is also ruled out, in that it was not received by the Jewish churches. In today's lesson, we have clearly demonstrated to White, Wallace and Erhman the historical method of textual criticism used by the Apostolic Churches that is founded on an objective set of criteria and relies on source texts that can establish a legal chain of custody to the Apostolic Churches. Turning to our present inquiry on the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark, we look historically to Eusebius, who was the first to call our attention to copies of St. Mark's Gospel that were deficient these verses. Now, to properly frame the context of this information, Eusebius is addressing a question from Marinus regarding the harmonization of the Gospel accounts, not the authenticity of these verses. Even though John William Bergen and Dr. Wilbur Pickering clearly establish that Eusebius was not against the genuineness of these last 12 verses, our textual examination is not dependent on the opinion of any one father, but what we can objectively evaluate. For Jerome, who was well aware of Eusebius's comment, not only quoted the passage under discussion, but these last 12 verses also passed his textual examination, thereby including it in his Vulgate edition. We also have Victor of Antioch, who personally evaluated the text in question after having read Eusebius. After a complete examination of the apostolic texts, Victor rendered his conclusion showing that the reading was apostolic, and was found in the most accurate copies, stating, "We at all events, inasmuch as in very many we have discovered to the exist, have, out of accurate copies, subjoined also the account of our Lord's ascension." Following the words, "For they were afraid," in conformity with the Palestinian exemplar of Mark, which exhibits the gospel verity, that is to say from the words, "Now when Jesus was risen early the first day of the week, and down to with signs following. Amen." Though the testimony and textual examination of these learned fathers bears significant witness to the genuineness of this passage, when we look to the versions that have been preserved in the Apostolic Churches, these last 12 verses meet the historical textual criterion for confirmation. We can all visit the historical independent Apostolic Greek, Aramaic, Coptic and Latin churches today, which basically testify to the apostolic origin of that passage. Yet, White, Wallace and Erhman are going to ignore all the evidence and continue relying on primarily two apocryphal texts, whose origin and history are unknown. For in our conversation with Dr. Pickering, he reiterated the same position, that White, Wallace and Erhman just ignore all the evidence. And it wasn't the Greek Orthodox churches editing the texts of the New Testament, as Daniel Wallace asserts, but it's the likes of White and Wallace who are truly editing the canon of scriptures.